Silas Crow didn't knock. He never knocked. He pushed through the front door of Mercer's General Store like he owned it, because, as far as he was concerned, he already did. The bell above the door swung hard and cracked against the frame. 3 customers scattered toward the wall. Evelyn Mercer stood behind the counter, and she didn't move, not even when Silas dropped a single folded paper onto her counter and pressed 2 thick fingers on top of it. 30 days, he said. Sign it, or I'll have the sheriff padlock this door so fast your little girl won't have time to grab her coat. Nobody spoke. Nobody looked at Evelyn. They looked at the floor, at their boots, at the jars of hard candy on the shelf. Anywhere but at the woman standing alone in the store her husband had built with his own hands. That was the moment Evelyn Mercer understood what it meant to be truly alone in a town full of people. If that were you, if the only thing your husband left behind was being ripped from your hands while the whole town watched and said nothing, what would you do? This is her story. And it begins with a stranger nobody wanted. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and stay with us until the very end, because this story is going to take you somewhere you didn't expect. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city and country you're watching from. I want to see how far these stories travel. Now, let's go back to Red Hollow and the cold evening that changed everything. The paper was still on the counter when the last customer left. Evelyn didn't read it. She already knew what it said. She'd been handed variations of the same document 3 times in the past 2 months, each one worded slightly differently, each one arriving with a little more pressure behind it. The first time Silas had sent a clerk. The second time he'd come himself but brought coffee and a sympathetic expression, talking about how hard it must be for a woman alone, how a fair price would let her start fresh somewhere easier. The third time he brought 2 men who stood near the door and didn't say anything. This time he'd waited until the store had customers. He'd wanted witnesses to her helplessness, not to his offer. She folded the paper into quarters and slid it into her apron pocket without opening it. Her daughter Clara was in the back room, doing arithmetic at the small table Evelyn's husband Daniel had nailed together from scrap lumber the winter before he died. Clara was 7, old enough to understand that something was wrong, young enough that Evelyn still tried to keep the shape of it from her. She could hear the girl's pencil scratching against the paper, slow and careful. Clara wrote like Daniel had, pressing too hard, leaving grooves in whatever was underneath. Evelyn began straightening the cans on the shelf nearest the window, not because they needed it, but because her hands needed something to do. Outside, the main street of Red Hollow was settling into early evening. The light came off the western ridge at a low angle that made everything look warmer than it was. The storefronts, the water trough, the packed dirt of the road. In a few minutes, the cold would come down fast, the way it always did that time of year. She'd need to bring in more wood before dark. She was still thinking about the wood when she heard the horse. Not the sound of it stopping, the sound of it struggling, something wrong in the gait, uneven and labored. She turned from the shelf and looked through the front window, and she saw a man on a brown mare coming up the center of the road at barely a walking pace. The horse was favoring its left foreleg. The man in the saddle was sitting straight enough, but there was a quality to his stillness that suggested he was working at it, the way people sit carefully when something hurts. He was wearing a canvas jacket so faded it had gone from whatever color it started as to a kind of general gray. His hat was battered at the brim, dented on one side and tilted at the angle of a man who hadn't looked in a mirror in a while. He had maybe 3 days of beard, not the deliberate kind, the kind that happens when a man doesn't think about it. His boots, from what she could see, had been resoled at least twice. He stopped the mare in front of the saloon across the street and dismounted slowly, one hand on the saddle horn. He tied the horse off at the post and stood for a moment with his hand on her neck, and even at that distance Evelyn could tell he was checking her, running his palm down the leg. She went back to straightening the cans. The yelling started about 4 minutes later. She heard Silas's voice first. She always heard Silas's voice first, because he'd trained himself to project it the way a man projects a voice when he wants the whole street to know he's talking. She couldn't make out the words through the glass, only the tone of them, which was the particular tone Silas used when he wanted to make something public. An audience tone. She moved to the window. Silas was standing in front of the saloon, a little to the side so the light caught him well, with 2 of his men flanking him at a respectful distance. The stranger was facing him. He hadn't stepped back. That was the first thing she noticed. Silas had positioned himself close, the kind of close that was meant to back a man up, and the stranger hadn't moved. She cracked the front door. "Don't know what rock you crawled out from under," Silas was saying, loud enough for the 3 or 4 people on the street to stop and pay attention, which was the point. "But Red Hollow doesn't need whatever it is you're selling. We've got enough drifters passing through, taking up space and contributing nothing. You want a drink? Drink it somewhere else. You want work? There is none. You want charity?" He paused for effect. "Try the church in Miller's Creek. That's about 12 miles east in case you can't read signs." A few people on the sidewalk laughed. Not big laughs. The kind that come out of people who've learned that agreeing with Silas Crow in public is usually the easier thing. The stranger said something. She couldn't hear it. Silas's expression shifted. Not to anger exactly. More like the irritation of a man who expected a reaction and didn't get the one he wanted. He said something else and gestured toward the road out of town, a broad dismissive wave. One of his men stepped slightly forward, the way men step forward when they want you to notice they're there. The stranger looked at the man who stepped forward. Then he looked back at Silas. He said something else, still quiet. Then he walked back to his horse, checked the leg one more time, and led her slowly down the street by the reins rather than mounting. She realized he was heading toward her store. She stepped back from the door. He came to a stop outside, tied his horse gently to her post, and came up the 2 steps to the door. He knocked, which was more than Silas had done. He waited. She opened the door. Up close, he looked more tired than he'd seemed from across the street. There was dust worked into the creases around his eyes, the kind that took days to accumulate. His eyes were a pale grayish-brown, not unfriendly, but careful. The eyes of someone who had learned to assess situations quickly and quietly. "Apologies for the disturbance," he said. His voice was low and unhurried. "Your sign says General Store. I'm hoping you carry liniment. My horse came up lame on the East Ridge, and I've been walking her in for 2 hours." "I have it," Evelyn said. She got it from the shelf. He paid without haggling, exact coin counted out from a worn leather pouch. He thanked her and turned to go. She didn't know then what made her say the next thing. She thought about it later and still couldn't entirely explain it. "There's a meal behind the store if you want it," she said. "I cook enough for leftovers, and tonight there's more than Clara and I will eat." He stopped at the door. "That's a generous offer," he said, with a kind of measured quality, like he was listening for something in the invitation. "It's leftover stew," she said. "Don't mistake it for generosity. I'd hate for good food to go to waste." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, more like the threat of one. "All right," he said. "Thank you, ma'am." His name, he told her over the meal, was Rowan Hale. He was passing through. He didn't say from where or to where, and she didn't ask. That was a frontier courtesy you learned early. Clara ate half her bowl and spent the rest of the meal staring at him with the unblinking focus children reserve for things they haven't categorized yet. Rowan Hale ate with the steady efficiency of a man who'd eaten a lot of meals outdoors, cleaning the bowl completely and setting his spoon down without a sound. "The man who spoke to you outside," Evelyn said. "That's Silas Crow. He owns about half the county and is working on the other half." "I got that impression," Rowan said. "He's not someone most people in this town argue with." "I didn't argue with him. I just didn't leave when he told me to." She looked at him. "That distinction probably doesn't mean much to Silas." "Probably not," he agreed. Clara had decided something. "Your horse has a hurt leg," she said. "She does," Rowan said. "She'll be better in a day or 2 if I give her rest." "What's her name?" "Scout." Clara considered this. "That's a good name," she said, with the conviction of someone who had spent real time thinking about what made a name good or not. "Mama's horse is named Franklin." "Franklin's a good name too," he said. Clara looked satisfied. Evelyn told him there was a spare stall in the small barn behind the store where Scout could rest, and that he was welcome to sleep there himself if he needed somewhere dry. She said it matter-of-factly, in the same tone she'd offered the stew. Not charity dressed up as something else, just a practical extension of what was already offered. He accepted in the same spirit. He was in the barn when she came out an hour later to check on Franklin, and he was doing something she hadn't expected. He had found, on his own, without asking, the broken hinge on the stall door that had been sticking for 3 months and was in the process of fixing it, working quietly in the lantern light with a pair of pliers he'd taken from his saddlebag. He didn't explain. She didn't ask. She checked on Franklin, said goodnight, and went inside. 3 days later, he was still there. Not because she'd asked him to stay, not because anything had been arranged or agreed. It had just happened the way things happen in practical circumstances. Scout needed more rest than 2 days, and while Scout rested, Rowan found things to fix. The hinge had led to a rotted board on the back fence, which led to a loose gate latch, which led to the water trough behind the barn that had been leaking slow enough that she'd learned to live with it rather than address it. He didn't announce any of this. She'd come out in the morning to find something done that had been broken the day before. He kept to himself otherwise, ate what was offered, stayed out of the store during business hours, and had the quality of stillness that made him easy to forget was there. The town had not forgotten. She could feel it in the way people moved through their transactions at the store. A little faster, a little more clipped. Martha Dunn, who usually stayed to talk for 10 or 15 minutes when she came in for flour, had come in twice in those 3 days and left within 5 minutes both times, glancing toward the back of the store as if she expected to see something there that she didn't want to see. Hector Price, who owned the feedlot and had been one of Daniel's oldest friends, had stopped outside the front window, looked in, and kept walking without coming in. On the 4th morning, she found out why. Agnes Pell was the wife of the man who ran the telegraph office, and Agnes Pell was one of those people who delivered unpleasant information with such genuine regret in her voice that you found yourself, somehow, thanking her for it. She came in just after opening and bought a packet of needles she didn't need, and then she said, carefully, that she just wanted Evelyn to know, because they were friends, and friends told each other things, that there was talk. "What kind of talk?" Evelyn said. Agnes's regret deepened. The talk, she said, was that Evelyn was harboring a known drifter, possibly an outlaw of some kind, in exchange for protection against Silas Crow. That she was in some kind of arrangement with this man. People were saying it was desperate and unseemly, and some were saying it was actually dangerous, keeping a stranger of unknown character that close to a child. Evelyn stood very still. "Who's saying it?" she said. Agnes looked at her needles. "You know how talk gets. It doesn't come from one place." Agnes looked up. "It started at the saloon," she said quietly, 2 nights ago. "You know whose table is in the back corner?" Evelyn knew. She thanked Agnes. She did it automatically, which she regretted afterward. And after Agnes left, she stood at the counter for a long moment looking at the door. Then she went to the back room where Clara was drawing something with a piece of charcoal on brown paper, and she said, "Finish what you're doing and then come mind the counter." And she went out to the barn. Rowan was there, repairing a section of bridle that had been cracked through the leather. "You should know," she said without preamble, "that Silas Crow has started telling people that I'm hiding an outlaw in my barn, that I've entered into some kind of arrangement with you for protection." He set the bridle down. He didn't look surprised, exactly. More like he'd been waiting for a next move and now knew what it was. "I'm sorry," he said. "That's my fault for staying. I don't recall asking you to leave." "No," he said, "but I put you in a difficult position by staying, and I should have considered that." She looked at him directly. "What I want you to know is that I've considered the position myself. I'm not a woman who makes decisions without thinking about them. I offered you the stall and the meals because I chose to, not because I needed something from you. If that makes me a subject of gossip, that's Silas Crow's doing, not mine. I won't pretend otherwise to make the town comfortable." He was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "Why aren't you afraid of him?" It wasn't the question she'd expected. She thought about it honestly. "I'm afraid of him," she said. "But being afraid of someone and being controlled by them aren't the same thing. Daniel, my husband, spent 2 years being afraid of the bank before we got this store paid down. He didn't let it stop him. He just felt it and kept working. I think that's the only thing to do with fear that makes any sense." Rowan Hale looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. "He sounds like he was a good man," he said. "He was," she said. "Not a perfect one, but a good one." She went back inside. She didn't know, and wouldn't for some time, what that conversation cost him to sit with. What it turned over in him that he'd been trying for years not to disturb. The creditors came on a Thursday. She'd been expecting it. Two men from the county bank in Harrow, not the local branch, the county seat, with papers and a formality to them that meant someone upstream had made a decision about her account. They were polite, professionally polite, the kind of polite that cost nothing, and communicated perfectly clearly that the conversation had already happened somewhere she hadn't been included. The short version, the note on her building was past due. The extension she'd been granted after Daniel died had expired 60 days ago. There had been, they said, new concerns raised about the viability of the property as collateral, and the bank was in the position of having to review its exposure. New concerns raised. She filed that phrase carefully. She asked who had raised them. They exchanged a look. Institutional concerns, the taller one said, not attributed to any individual. She told them she understood and asked for 2 weeks. They gave her 10 days. After they left, she sat at the counter and did the arithmetic she'd been avoiding for weeks. It did not improve under examination. She had enough stock to run on for another month, maybe 6 weeks if she was careful. She had $43 in the strongbox under the floorboard in the back room, which was everything liquid she possessed. She had the building, which she was about to lose. She had Franklin, who was old and worth less every year. She had the inventory, which she owned outright. She had Clara. She was still sitting there when Rowan came in from the side door, not the customer entrance, the one that led through from the storage passage at the back. He stopped when he saw her face. She told him about the bankmen. She didn't intend to. It wasn't his business. But she was tired, and he was there, and there was something about him that made telling him feel less like weakness than it would have with most people. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "The phrase new concerns raised. Did they say that specifically?" "Word for word." He nodded slowly. "That means someone contacted them. Someone with enough standing to get the bank to move." He looked at the front window. Banks don't accelerate notes on their own when a borrower's been making partial payments. Someone made a call. She already knew who, but hearing him say it plainly, just the mechanics of it, stated without dramatics, made the shape of the scheme clearer and somehow worse. It was so deliberate. Silas wasn't angry, wasn't reckless. He was methodical. He'd mapped the points of pressure, and he was working through them in order. "What happens if you can't keep the building?" Rowan said. It wasn't a gentle question. He was asking because he wanted the actual answer. "I lose the store," she said. "The stock becomes collateral. I'd have 30 days to vacate. After that, Claire and I have Franklin and $43. And your land deed, the property under the building." She looked at him. "The land deed is what he wants. Without the store, I'd have no reason to stay. He's counting on that." Rowan said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Do you have the deed here?" "In the strongbox." "Has anyone outside your family ever held it, or a copy of it?" She thought. "Daniel took it to Harrow once to have it registered with the county. That was 8 years ago, before we built." "Then there's a county record," Rowan said. "Forged documents can override a lot of things. But a county registration from 8 years ago is harder to erase than people think. You'd need someone inside the county recorder's office to alter the original books, and that leaves a mark." She stared at him. "How do you know that?" He was quiet for a beat too long. "I've dealt with property disputes," he said. It was true. It was also, she would eventually understand, one of the most profoundly understated sentences she had ever heard anyone speak. She didn't press it. "So what are you saying?" she said. "I'm saying your deed might be more defensible than he's counting on," Rowan said, "and that you shouldn't give him the satisfaction of assuming it's already lost before someone's looked at the full picture." She looked at him for a long moment. "I'll get the deed out tonight," she said, "and look at what I have." He nodded and started to stand. "Rowan," she said. He paused. "Whatever you know about property law," she said carefully, "and wherever you learned it, I'd rather know who I'm trusting than find out later I misjudged." He held her gaze, and she saw it then. Not guilt exactly, but something that was the emotional cousin of it. The careful, compressed look of a man carrying something he'd been carrying for a long time and hadn't yet decided what to do with it. "I'll tell you what you need to know," he said, "when the time is right for it to help rather than confuse things." It wasn't a full answer. She knew it wasn't a full answer, but there was something in the directness of the way he said it. Not evasion, more like a man trying to sequence things honestly, that made her accept it. For now. Outside, the wind had come up off the ridge, and the temperature was dropping the way it dropped in Red Hollow in October, fast and without negotiation. She could hear it moving through the boards at the back of the store, looking, as it always did, for the gaps. She pulled her shawl tighter and went to get the strongbox. There was going to be a fight. She'd known that since Silas first walked through her door with his folded paper and his 2 fingers pressing it down like he was holding something dead in place. She'd been telling herself she wasn't ready, that she needed more time, more money, more something. But sitting at that counter with the arithmetic in her head and a man in her storeroom who knew more than he was saying, she realized that more time wasn't coming. It never did. The only question left was what she was going to do with the time she had. She opened the strongbox and took out the deed. The paper was old and soft at the folds, the ink still clear enough. She spread it on the counter and looked at it in the lantern light. Daniel Mercer. Evelyn Mercer. 12 acres, including the parcel at the north end of Red Hollow's main road, surveyed and registered in the county of Harrow, September of 1871. Her name was on it. Had been on it from the beginning. She hadn't let herself think about that in a long time. Hadn't let herself hold on to what it meant that Daniel had insisted on that. Had ridden all the way to the county seat and made sure her name was there beside his. He'd never explained why. She'd never asked. Some things between them had always been like that, understood without needing to be said. She folded the deed carefully and held it. Outside, Red Hollow was going dark. Somewhere down the street, a door slammed. A horse blew hard against the cold. And somewhere under all of it, in the particular silence that comes after a decision settles into a person's bones, Evelyn Mercer made up her mind. She was not moving. Not for Silas Crow. Not for the bank. Not for the gossips who'd stopped coming into her store because a tired stranger with a lame horse had eaten dinner in her yard. She was going to stay, and she was going to fight, and she was going to do it with a deed that had her name on it, and a stubbornness that Daniel had always said was her least convenient and most essential quality. Whatever came next, it was going to have to come through her first. The deed stayed on the counter until nearly midnight. Evelyn had sent Clara to bed at the usual hour, kissed her forehead the same way she always did, said nothing about bankmen or forged concerns, or the folded paper still sitting in her apron pocket. Clara had looked at her with those steady eyes that were so much like Daniel's it sometimes stopped Evelyn cold, and asked if everything was all right. And Evelyn had said yes in the tone she reserved for things that were not entirely yes, but were not yet no. After Clara was asleep, she brought the lantern to the counter and laid the deed out beside the bank notice and the letter Silas's clerk had delivered 3 weeks before that one, and the original purchase agreement from 1871 that Daniel had kept in a tin box beneath the strong box, nested inside it like something he'd known might need protecting. She read through all of it slowly, not looking for anything specific, just trying to understand the full shape of what she was dealing with before Rowan came back in the morning. He knocked at 7. She'd been up since 5. There was coffee on, and she poured him a cup without asking whether he wanted one. He sat down at the small table in the back room that Clara used for arithmetic, and he looked at the documents she'd arranged there, and he didn't say anything for a while. The 1871 registration, he said finally. That's the one that matters. Everything else Silas does has to account for that, or it falls apart. Can he get to it? Rowan picked up the county notice and read it through once. He'd need someone in the recorder's office willing to alter the original ledger. That's not impossible, but it's a different kind of corruption than bribing a bank officer. Bank officers deal in discretion. County clerks deal in public records. The exposure is higher. You think he hasn't done it yet? I think if he had, he'd have moved faster. The bank pressure, the rumors, the creditor notices, those are designed to make you sell voluntarily. If he'd already secured the record, he wouldn't need to soften you up first. He'd just move legally and be done with it. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. The morning was cold, and the stove in the back room had been slow to come up. So there's still time, she said. There's still time, he said, but not much. Once he figures out you're not going to fold, he'll go for the record. She looked at him. What would stop him? Someone getting to Harrow first and pulling a certified copy of the original registration, filed independently. That creates a second anchor. 2 documents that would both have to be altered to make the forgery hold. It raises the risk to the point where even a corrupt official might not take the chance. Can that be done? Yes, he said, and then after a pause that she noticed, I can do it if you want. I know the process. She looked at him steadily. He held it. Why? She said. It was a single word, and she meant it to carry everything it needed to carry. Why are you still here? Why do you know this? Why are you offering? Why should I trust what I don't understand about you? He set his coffee down. There was a man who worked for me, he said, years ago, young, maybe 22. Good worker, careful with animals, the kind of person you counted on without thinking about it because he was just always there. We were driving cattle across a river crossing in high water. Not ideal conditions, but we'd done it before, and I made the call to go. He stopped. He didn't make it across. The current took him before anyone could get to him. I pulled him out, but it was too late. The back room was quiet. The stove ticked. A court looked at it and called it an accident, he said. Weather conditions, unforeseeable hazard, no negligence found. The paperwork said I was clear. The paperwork was probably right, technically, but I made the call to cross. He was 22. Evelyn didn't say anything. She waited. After that, I couldn't be where I'd been, he said. Couldn't be the man who stood at the head of a table and made decisions that other people paid the cost of. So I left. I left the ranch, the operation, everything, and I just moved. Took the horse, took my tools, and went. He looked at the table. I've been doing that for about 3 years. What's waiting back there? She said. Everything I walked away from, he said, which is considerable, which I'm not ready to talk about in more detail than that. She nodded once. It was enough for now, and she recognized that, knew the difference between a man protecting a secret that would hurt you and a man protecting a wound that he hadn't finished deciding what to do with. Go to Harrow, she said. Get the copy filed. He left that morning before the store opened, riding Scout, who had come back sound and steady. Evelyn watched him go from the front window and then turned to open the door for the day, and tried not to notice how few people came through it. The week that followed was the worst one since Daniel died. Not because anything dramatic happened. That was the strange part. Nothing exploded. Nothing came to a head. It was quieter than that, and the quiet was worse. The store traffic dropped to almost nothing. 2 families who had been regular customers sent their children instead of coming themselves, with small lists and exact change, and the children looked at their shoes and didn't make conversation. Hector Price came in on Wednesday, finally, and bought a box of nails. And when she tried to ask how things were at the feedlot, he said fine, and was out the door in under 2 minutes. Martha Dunn came in on Thursday, and that was worse, because Martha Dunn was not capable of subtlety, and her discomfort filled the room the moment she walked in. She bought 2 things and then stood at the counter opening and closing her reticule, and finally she said that she hoped Evelyn knew she didn't believe any of it personally. Any of what? Evelyn said. Martha looked distressed. The talk, she said. About the man. I just want you to know that personally I don't. Martha, Evelyn said, what are they saying now? The version that had gotten to Martha, which meant it was the version that had saturated the town completely, was that the stranger Evelyn was keeping in her barn was a fugitive from somewhere in Nevada, wanted for robbery, and that Evelyn had made some kind of arrangement with him, the details of which Martha wouldn't repeat but which were being described as improper, and that several families were uncomfortable bringing their children into the store under the circumstances. Evelyn stood very still. Who said Nevada? She said. I couldn't say where it started. Someone said Nevada specifically, Evelyn said. That's a specific enough detail that someone named it. Who? Martha closed her reticule. I heard it at the ladies' auxiliary meeting. Cora Price brought it up. She said she'd heard it from her husband, who heard it at the saloon. So it had a path. Silas to the saloon, to Hector Price, to Cora Price, to the ladies' auxiliary, to every household in Red Hollow within 48 hours. Efficient. She had to give him that. After Martha left, Evelyn locked the front door, turned the sign to closed at 2 in the afternoon, and sat in the back room and let herself feel the full weight of it for about 20 minutes. She didn't cry. She thought about it, thought it might help. But what came up instead of tears was a hard and specific anger that had no outlet and nowhere to go. So she just sat with it until it settled into something more manageable. Then she got up, unlocked the door, turned the sign back around, and went to work. Clara came home from the schoolhouse at 4 and didn't say anything until dinner, and then she said, Jimmy Price told me at recess that his ma says I shouldn't play at his house anymore. Evelyn put her fork down. Did he say why? She said. He said his ma said there was trouble at our house. Clara was looking at her plate. Is there trouble at our house? Jimmy Price's mother, Evelyn said carefully, is repeating things she's heard without knowing if they're true. There's no trouble at our house. There's a man helping in the barn whose name is Rowan, and he's been nothing but decent to us, and some people in town have decided to make a story out of it. Clara looked up. Why? Because some people, Evelyn said, would rather have a story than the truth. The story is more interesting to them. Clara thought about this. That doesn't seem right. It isn't, Evelyn agreed. Eat your dinner. Clara ate. Then she said, Is Rowan coming back? I expect so. Good, Clara said. He fixed the gate. Rowan came back on Friday evening with a document folder tucked inside his jacket and the particular economy of movement of a man who had accomplished something and didn't feel the need to announce it. He'd gotten to Harrow, located the county recorder's office, pulled the original registration from the 1871 ledger, and filed for a certified duplicate, which had been stamped and witnessed, and which now existed as an independent legal instrument in the county archive. He explained all of this in about 4 sentences while she read through the certified copy. It'll hold, he said. Whatever he's got forged, this predates it and corroborates your original. Any judge who looks at both documents is going to want to know why the forgery appeared 60-plus years after the original registration. He could still get to someone at the recorder's office. He could, Rowan said, but now there are 2 anchors instead of 1, and the certified copy has a witness signature from a county official who I'd expect is not on Silas Crow's payroll. The man looked like he'd been there since before Silas was born and had the disposition of someone who doesn't like being told what to do. She almost smiled at that. She filed the certified copy in the tin box beside the original deed, relocked the strong box, and replaced the floorboard. You should know, she said when she stood up, that the story has gotten to Nevada now. He looked at her. They're saying you're a fugitive from Nevada, she said. Robbery. Something moved across his face that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite the opposite. I've never been to Nevada, he said. I didn't think so, she said, but I want you to know what's being said because it affects you as much as me. He was quiet for a moment. Mrs. Mercer. Evelyn, she said. It came out more firmly than she intended. She'd been correcting him on that for a week, and he kept reverting. Please. Evelyn, he said. Whatever he says about me, it doesn't matter. I don't have a reputation here to protect. You do. Don't let concern for me factor into your decisions about how to handle this. You're the one who just rode to Harrow and back in 2 days to file a document on my behalf, she said. So I'll decide what factors into my decisions. He looked at her for a moment and then looked away, out the small window at the side of the barn that showed the back of the store and a strip of gray evening sky. There's something else you should know, he said. While I was in Harrow, I looked into the property claims Silas has been filing with the county over the past few years. She went still. He's done this before, Rowan said. Not just here. 2 other properties in the county. Both small operations, both single owners without much legal recourse. One sold, one went under. In both cases, there were notes in the margin of the county records about disputed deeds that were eventually resolved in Silas's favor. He paused. Resolved unusually fast for a legal process, and in both cases, the presiding magistrate for the resolution was the same man. Who? Judge Arlen Dobbins, he said, out of the Harrow Circuit. Evelyn sat down on the edge of the stall rail. Dobbins handles the circuit court for this district, she said. I know. So if Silas files a legal claim, it would most likely come to Dobbins, Rowan said. Yes. She took a breath. The barn smelled like hay and leather and the particular smell of Scout, who was in the far stall eating contentedly and apparently unbothered by any of this. What do we do about that, she said. You find a lawyer who isn't from this circuit, he said. Someone from outside Harrow. Silas's influence has geography. It doesn't extend everywhere. He looked at her. I know someone in Dalton, 60 miles east. His name is Emmett Cross. He's been practicing property law for 30 years, and he's never lost a boundary dispute. I can write to him. You know a property lawyer in Dalton, she said. I know a lot of people, he said. And there it was again, that careful, pressurized pause that happened when he came close to something he wasn't ready to say. We have history. He'll take the case if I ask him to. She should have pushed. She knew that, even then. But she was tired, and the case itself was the more pressing thing, and some part of her had begun to understand that the whole of Rowan Hale would come out on its own schedule, and pressing it would only put him back on the horse heading west. "Write the letter," she said. He wrote it that night at the small table in the back room, by lamplight, while she balanced the store ledger on the other side of the table, and Clara slept down the hall. It was an odd kind of domestic quiet that neither of them commented on. Both of them occupied, the only sounds the scratch of pen and pencil and the occasional pop from the dying stove. At one point he stopped and looked at what he'd written and crossed out 2 full lines. "What are you taking out?" she said without looking up from the ledger. "Things that would raise more questions than they answer," he said. She looked up then. He was looking at the letter with an expression she couldn't decode, and the pen was held loosely in his hand, not writing. "Rowan," she said. "There's more money involved than I've led you to believe," he said. Not quickly, carefully. Like someone placing something heavy down on a surface they weren't sure would hold. "In terms of what I can bring to bear on this situation, if it comes to it. I haven't used it because I didn't want you to think the offer came with strings. But you should know it exists." She looked at him for a long moment. "How much more?" she said. "Enough that Emmett Cross will take this case the day he gets the letter," he said. "Enough that getting a second surveyor and an independent witness from outside the circuit would be an inconvenience rather than an impossibility." "That's not an amount," she said. "That's a category." He met her eyes. "It's a significant amount," he said. She set down her pencil. "I need you to understand something," she said. "I appreciate what you're offering, genuinely. But if you're carrying money that changes the scale of this fight, then there are things I need to know about you before I agree to that kind of help. Not because I'm ungrateful, because I'm not a fool. I don't take help from people I don't understand." He nodded. It was a slow nod, like something settling. "That's fair," he said, "and I'll tell you. Not tonight, not because I'm hiding it from you, but because once I say it, it changes things, and I want to make sure the case is in motion first. I don't want the telling to become the thing that derails the doing." She studied him. He wasn't evasive, that was the thing. Evasive people had a quality of motion to them, a way of redirecting. He was utterly still. He was just sequencing. "After the letter goes," she said. "After the letter goes," he agreed. She picked up her pencil. He went back to the letter. They sat like that for another hour, the stove cooling down, the lamp burning lower, the two of them working in the same room without speaking, and it was the most ordinary evening Evelyn had spent since Daniel died, which was the thing she thought about after she locked up and went to bed. The strange, unglamorous ordinariness of it, 2 people sitting at a table doing what needed to be done. The letter went out on the Monday morning coach. By Tuesday afternoon, Silas Crow had done something that told her he'd been watching the post office. She was in the store when Walt Diggins came in. Walt ran the small hardware operation at the south end of the street. Nothing fancy, bolts and hinges and rope. The kind of business that serviced the businesses. He'd been quiet around her the past 2 weeks, politely distant, but this was different. He came in with an expression she recognized as the expression of a man delivering something he'd been told to deliver and didn't entirely want to. He said that the General Merchants Association, which was a loose arrangement of the 6 main retail operations in Red Hollow, formed after a dispute over water access 3 years ago, had held a meeting the previous evening. At that meeting, it had been raised that the association's reputation could be affected by one of its members being involved in a legal dispute of a potentially criminal nature. I was using someone else's words, she could hear it in the cadence. Someone had told him what to say, and he was reciting it imperfectly. She let him finish. Then she said, "Who called the meeting?" Walt looked uncomfortable. "It was a general." "Walt," she said. "I've known you 11 years. Don't do this to me." He looked at his boots. "Silas sent word around," he said. "Said there'd be a meeting. Said it pertained to the good standing of the association. When I got there, it was just Silas and 2 of his people and Hector Price." "And what did Silas say specifically?" Walt rubbed the back of his neck. "He said that given the uncertainty around your property situation and the character concerns around your current house guest, the association needed to consider whether your membership was appropriate going forward. He said it was nothing personal. He said it was about the community's interests." She said nothing. Walt looked more miserable. "Evelyn, I voted against it, for what that's worth." "What was the vote?" 3-1 to suspend your membership pending resolution of the property matter. He said it quietly, Like if he said it quietly enough, it would land softer. Which means you can't participate in the shared buying agreements. Which means your supply costs go up. She did the arithmetic instantly, the way she'd been doing arithmetic constantly for 2 months. Without the association buying agreements, she'd pay roughly 15 to 20% more on most of her stock orders. On the margins she was already operating on, that wasn't sustainable past 60 days. He knew that. That was the point. She thanked Walt for coming to tell her himself, and he left, looking relieved and guilty in equal measure, which was what happened to decent people who'd been maneuvered into taking a position they wouldn't have chosen freely. She went to the back room and stood at the window that looked out toward the barn. She could see Rowan through the gap in the door, doing something with a piece of harness leather, working steadily, not looking up. She stood there for a moment. Then she went back to the counter, opened her ledger, and began calculating what she could strip from her stock orders to offset the cost increase. It wasn't enough. The numbers wouldn't go that far. But she wrote it down anyway, because writing it down was the only way to see it clearly, and seeing it clearly was the only way to fight it. That evening, after dinner, Rowan told her about the Hale Cattle Company. Not everything. She understood later that he gave her the skeleton first, letting her adjust before adding the weight. He told her he owned a cattle operation of significant size, multiple ranches across 3 counties, about 1,200 head, permanent staff of 60 plus, contracts with regional markets that had been in place long enough to be institutional. She listened. Her face didn't change, not on the outside. How significant, she said. He told her. The number sat in the air between them. Clara had gone to bed 20 minutes earlier. The house was very quiet. "You've been fixing my fence," Evelyn said. "Yes." "And sleeping in my barn." "Yes." She stood up and walked to the window and looked out at the dark street. A dog was crossing from one side to the other, unhurried. A light was on in the telegraph office. "Why?" she said. "I told you some of it," he said. "After the accident. After the man who died. You told me you walked away. You didn't tell me you walked away from that." She gestured without turning. "That's not the same thing." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." "So why are you here? In Red Hollow? In my barn?" He was quiet for a moment, not evasive, just honest about the fact that the answer was complicated. "After I left," he said, "I spent about 8 months not talking to anyone much, just moving. And what I found, when I was nobody, when I was a drifter with a lame horse coming into a town where no one knew me, was that people tell you a lot, without meaning to, about what they actually value. Most places, I got looked through, or treated like a liability, like my presence was something to be managed." He paused. "And then I rode into Red Hollow, and a woman I'd never met offered me stew because she didn't want food to go to waste." She turned around. I was looking at her steadily, the way he always looked at her, without performance, without the kind of careful arrangement men sometimes put on their faces when they were trying to make a point. Just direct. "It wasn't a test," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I didn't ride in here running some kind of evaluation. I had a lame horse, and I was tired, and you were kind. That's all it was. But it meant something, more than I expected." She looked at him for a long time. "You're still the man who can outspend Silas Crow 10 times over," she said. "Yes." "And you're choosing not to." "I'm choosing not to use money as the weapon," he said. "Because that's not a fight. That's just a different kind of bullying. What he's done to you is wrong because of what it is, not just because he's doing it to someone who can't match him financially. The answer to that isn't me crushing him with a bigger wallet. The answer is the law doing what the law is supposed to do. I can support that. I can't replace it." She sat back down across from him. She folded her hands on the table. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. Outside, the wind had come back up. It found every gap in the building, which was more gaps than she'd managed to fill, and she could hear it moving through the walls, persistent and indifferent to all of it, to Silas Crow and his forged documents, to the Ladies' Auxiliary and their stories about Nevada, to the Merchants Association and its suspension vote, to a woman with $43 and a deed with her name on it, and a man at her table who had 1,200 cattle and had chosen to sleep in her barn because she'd offered him stew. She sat there. And somewhere in the space between the wind and the lamplight and the arithmetic that still didn't work, and the man who still hadn't told her everything, something shifted in her chest that she wasn't ready to name and wasn't going to name yet. She was practical enough for that. But she felt it, and she didn't push it away, and that was its own kind of decision. The ledger stayed open on the table. The numbers were still bad. But for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was reading them alone. Emmett Cross's reply came 11 days after Rowan sent the letter. It arrived on a Tuesday, on the same morning Coach that had taken the original letter out, which meant Cross had turned his response around within 48 hours of receiving it. That was the first thing Evelyn noticed. The second thing she noticed was the weight of the envelope. It wasn't a single page. She could feel the thickness of it through the paper. Rowan read it at the back table while she opened the store. He didn't read it out loud and he didn't summarize it immediately, which she'd learned was his way. He processed things completely before he spoke about them, which was either a virtue or a test of patience depending on the morning. After about 10 minutes, he set it down. "He's taking the case," he said. "He'll be here in 3 weeks. He wants all original documents, the certified copy from Harrow, and any written correspondence from Silas or the bank, every piece of paper that's moved in this dispute." 3 weeks, she said. "He has a matter in Dalton to close first. He says he'll send his associate ahead in 10 days to begin gathering depositions." She thought about the math. 3 weeks was manageable if nothing escalated. It was a long time if Silas decided to move before then. "What else does the letter say?" she said. Rowan picked it up again and read one section aloud. Not the whole thing, she noticed, just a piece of it. Cross had written that based on what Rowan had described, the pattern of conduct suggested not just individual fraud, but a coordinated scheme of property acquisition through intimidation, and that if other affected parties in the county could be identified and were willing to testify, the case became exponentially stronger. He used the word exponentially. He was the kind of lawyer who used that word and meant it technically. "Other affected parties," Evelyn said. "The 2 properties I told you about," Rowan said. "The ones from the county records. One sold, but the family might still be willing to talk. The other went under. I don't know where those people ended up. Cross's associate will look into it." She stood at the counter and thought about this. There was something both steadying and frightening about it. The case growing larger than just her store, larger than the 12 acres with her name on the deed. It felt right, the way right things sometimes feel. Not comfortable exactly, but correct. "He'll know," she said. "Silas. He watches the post office, which means he probably has someone watching the coach arrivals too. He'll know Cross is coming." "Yes," Rowan said. "He will." She looked at him. "And that means he'll move before Cross gets here if he can." "Yes," Rowan said again. "It does." They looked at each other across the store, she behind the counter with the morning light coming through the front window, he at the back table with Cross's letter in his hand. And neither of them said what they both understood, which was that the next 3 weeks were going to be the most dangerous of all of them. The glass broke on a Wednesday night, 12 days after the letter went out. Evelyn was asleep when it happened. A sharp, close sound that brought her upright before she was fully conscious, her hand already reaching for the edge of the bed, her feet already finding the floor. Clara's room was 2 steps down the hall. She was moving before her mind had finished assembling what the sound meant. Clara was awake and sitting up, eyes wide, not crying. That was the thing about Clara. She was 7 years old, and she didn't cry when she was scared. She went very still and very watchful, which was either a strength or a sign of something Evelyn hadn't let herself think about too carefully. "Stay here," Evelyn said. "Don't come out." "What was—" "Stay here, Clara, I mean it." She went to the hallway. The smell reached her before she got to the end of it. Not smoke yet, but something chemical underneath the cold air, the particular sharpness of lamp oil. She looked toward the front of the store and saw the orange line at the base of the front door, thin and flickering, and for one suspended second her mind refused to process what she was seeing. Then it did. She went back for Clara. She didn't go through the front. She took Clara's hand and went through the back passage and out the side door that opened onto the narrow strip of ground between the store and the fence. And she was calling for Rowan before she was fully outside, her voice coming out rougher than she intended. Clara was barefoot on the cold ground and Evelyn was in her nightgown and neither of them had coats. Rowan was already coming out of the barn. He'd heard something. She found out later he'd heard the glass break and been on his feet before she'd called his name. He came across the yard at a run and she grabbed his arm. "Front of the store," she said. "Lamp oil. The door." He looked at her face and then at Clara, and then he went, and she almost went with him and stopped herself because Clara's hand was in hers, and she couldn't leave Clara alone in the dark yard. She heard him kick the front door open, heard the change in sound that meant the fire had found more air. She moved Clara to the fence at the far edge of the yard, put her back against it, and told her not to move. And she went to the side of the building and looked around the corner. The front of the store was burning. Not fully, not yet, but the oil had been laid across the base of the door and along the front wall, and it had caught well. Rowan was inside. She could see movement through the window that hadn't broken yet, his shape against the orange, and she was calculating time, distance, whether he could get what he needed and get out, when she heard the creak and pop that meant structural heat. "Rowan," she said it loud. Not screaming, but loud. He came out the front door with his arm over his face, and behind him he was dragging. She realized he'd gone in not for himself but for the strongbox. He'd known exactly where it was. He'd gone to the back room and pulled the floorboard and gotten the box out, and he came through the door with it under one arm and blood on his forearm from the broken glass and his jacket smoking at the shoulder. He dropped the box on the ground and turned back. "Don't," she said. "The ledger. Rowan." She grabbed his arm, the one that wasn't burned. "It's too late. Don't." He stopped. He looked at the fire, which was moving up the front wall now, reaching for the overhang. She could hear people on the street, voices, someone shouting for water, the particular sound of a crowd assembling around a disaster too late to stop it. He let her pull him back from the door. They stood in the street and watched the front of the building burn, and people came with buckets from the water trough and from the well at the end of the block, and it took 40 minutes to get it under control. By then the front wall was gone, and the roof over the store was compromised, and the inside was a ruin of black and ash, and the inventory she'd spent 11 years accumulating. The back room held. The walls that mattered held. The building was not destroyed. It was badly damaged, dangerously so, but the back portion where Daniel had built the table and where Clara did her arithmetic was still standing when the fire was finally out. Clara stood beside Evelyn the whole time, holding her hand without being told to. At some point, Walt Diggins appeared with a blanket and put it around Evelyn's shoulders. She thanked him without looking at him. She was watching the building and doing the specific kind of arithmetic you do when you're calculating the gap between what you have and what it would take to rebuild, and the number was not a number she could close. When it was over, Rowan sat down on the ground with his back against the water trough and looked at his arm. The burn on his forearm wasn't serious. The smoke damage to his jacket was worse, but he was favoring it, holding it slightly away from his body. She went and crouched beside him and looked at it without touching. "It needs washing," she said. "I know." "And wrapping." "I know, Evelyn." She looked at his face. He was looking at the building. His expression was the expression of a man who was angry in a very specific and controlled way. Not the hot kind of angry that made people do reckless things, but the cold kind, the kind that settles in and stays. "Were you hurt anywhere else?" she said. "No." "You went in for the strongbox." "The deed is in the strongbox," he said, "and the certified copy. Without those, the legal case starts from scratch." She sat down beside him on the ground, not next to him, a foot away, which was the distance of people who haven't yet closed the last space but aren't pretending it doesn't exist. Clara came and sat on her other side, leaning slightly against her arm. "He's not going to stop," Clara said. Both of them looked at her. "Jimmy Price," Clara said. "He told me his pa said that once Mr. Crow decides something, it happens. He said that's just how it is." She looked at the building. "I don't think that's how it has to be." Evelyn looked at her daughter for a moment. "No," she said. "It isn't." The morning came up cold and gray, the kind of morning that didn't bother with a sunrise, just moved from dark to less dark over the space of an hour. Evelyn had spent the night in the barn with Clara and Rowan, none of them sleeping much. She'd wrapped his arm with strips of cloth from her sewing kit, and he'd sat still for it, which she'd appreciated. Clara had fallen asleep sometime after 3, curled on a horse blanket in the corner that Rowan had arranged for her without being asked. By 6, Evelyn was standing in front of the building. The front wall was mostly intact from the inside, though it was compromised at the top where the overhang had burned through. The inventory in the front section was a loss. The heat damage alone would have done it even without the direct burning. But the back room, the storage passage, the kitchen behind it, her bedroom and Clara's, those had come through. Smoke-stained, cold, the ceiling in the store proper buckled in one corner, but standing. She stood there with the lantern Daniel had kept on the counter for as long as she'd known him. She'd grabbed it on her way out without thinking. It was the kind of thing your hands do when your mind is somewhere else. She heard people gathering behind her. Not many. 6, 7. She recognized Walt's voice and Agnes Pell's and a couple of the ranch families from the north edge of town who'd always been good customers. They'd come to see the damage. Some of them maybe came to see what she'd do. She turned around. "I'm going to rebuild," she said. She said it plainly, not with drama, just with the clarity of a decision that had already been made somewhere in the night while she was watching her daughter sleep on a horse blanket. "I know some of you think that's foolish. I know some of you have been keeping your distance because you're afraid of Silas Crow, and I understand that. But I'm not moving. I'm not selling. This is my family's land and my husband's building and my daughter's inheritance, and I will rebuild every board of it if I have to do it alone." She wasn't looking for applause. She wasn't even entirely sure why she said it out loud rather than just getting to work. But she looked at Walt Diggins while she said it, and she looked at Agnes Pell, and she looked at the two ranch families in the back, and she wanted them to know the same way Silas wanted people to know things when he positioned himself in good light on the main street. Information moved in Red Hollow. She was going to make sure this piece of it moved correctly. Rowan was standing at the edge of the group. He caught her eye, and something passed between them. Not words, not even quite a look, more like a calibration. She knew he was about to disappear. She'd seen it coming since the night before. In the way he'd gone quiet after the fire was out. The particular quality of silence that meant he was calculating something he hadn't shared yet. By noon, he was gone. He left Scout in the barn, which she took as confirmation he was coming back. Rowan Hale was not a man who walked away from a horse. He left without saying where he was going or how long he'd be. He told Clara he'd see her soon, and he told Evelyn he'd be back before Cross's associate arrived. He said it with the specificity of a man who had a plan. She let him go. The day after the fire, Silas Crow came to see the damage. He didn't come alone. He brought the two men who were usually with him, and he came in the middle of the morning when the street was busy, when there were people to see him being reasonable. He stood outside the burned front of the store and shook his head slowly, in the manner of a man greatly saddened by the misfortunes of others. Evelyn was inside, sweeping ash. She heard him from where she was. His voice carried the way it always carried. "Terrible thing," he said to whoever was nearest. "Just terrible. A woman alone dealing with all this. I hope she knows the offer still stands. More than fair, considering." She kept sweeping. He came to the open front. The door was propped back, the frame too warped to close properly, and stood in the opening. She didn't stop sweeping. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "I am truly sorry about this." She looked up at him. She let the silence sit for a moment. "Are you?" she said. Something moved in his face. Not guilt. Silas Crow didn't carry guilt the way ordinary people did. She'd come to understand that. It was more like the calculation of a man adjusting to an unexpected response. "This is a dangerous situation for a woman in your position," he said. "The building's compromised. Your inventory's gone. Your credit's stretched. I'm not your enemy, Evelyn." "Don't do that," she said. "Do what?" "Use my first name like it means we're friends." She set the broom down against the wall and faced him. "You went to the bank. You contacted the county official. You spread rumors through your people at the saloon and got my membership suspended through the Merchants Association. And 2 nights ago, someone laid lamp oil along the base of my front wall and set it alight." She kept her voice level. "I don't know what you think you're here to offer me, but it would help us both if you dropped the sadness." He looked at her for a long moment. When he spoke again, the reasonable tone was still there, but the sadness was gone. That was more honest, she thought. She preferred it. "You're a smart woman," he said, "which is why I'm surprised you can't see that you've already lost. Whatever your wandering friend is planning, and I know he's gone somewhere. I know he's not just out riding. It won't matter. This property is going to be mine. The only question is whether you sell it standing or wait until it's condemned and get nothing." He tilted his head slightly. "That little girl of yours deserves better than a mother who lets pride run them both into the ground." She picked the broom back up. "Get off my property, Mr. Crow," she said. He left. But he left slowly, which was its own kind of answer. She swept for another 2 hours without stopping, working her way through the ash and the broken glass and the warped wood. And she didn't let herself think about what he'd said about Clara, because if she let herself think about it, she'd have to sit down, and sitting down right now was not something she could afford. Cross's associate arrived on a Thursday, 4 days after the fire. His name was Peter Ansel, younger than she'd expected, maybe 30, with the precise and slightly compressed manner of a man who processed things quickly and didn't waste words. He came with a leather satchel, a notebook, and the air of someone who had been briefed thoroughly and was here to work, not to assess. He looked at the burned building, looked at her, said, "I've seen worse outcomes. Let's go over the documents." She liked him immediately. They spent 3 hours at the back table going through everything. The original deed, the certified copy from Harrow, the bank notices, Silas's letters, the forged document that the bank officer had referenced in his correspondence without apparently questioning. Ansel took notes in a shorthand she couldn't read, asked pointed questions, and occasionally said things like, "There it is," or "That'll hold," in a quiet, satisfied way that made her feel, for the first time, that someone with actual legal knowledge had looked at her situation and found something to work with. He also told her things she hadn't known. The property that had sold to Silas 2 years ago, the Garrity farm, 8 miles south. The family hadn't left the county. They were living with the wife's sister in Miller's Creek. Ted Garrity had never stopped being angry about the sale, but he'd had no resources to pursue it. Ansel had already sent word through Cross's office. Garrity had agreed to speak. The second property, the Holt operation that had gone under, was more complicated. The Holts had dispersed, different directions, but Ansel had located the eldest son in a town 40 miles north and had a letter back saying the son had kept records. He'd kept every piece of paper his father had ever received from Silas Crow or the county or the bank, kept them in a tin box, not knowing why, just knowing that they mattered. Evelyn thought about the tin box under her own floorboard. "People keep the evidence," she said, almost to herself. "They do," Ansel said. "More often than the people who create the problems expect. It's actually the most consistent thing I've found in this kind of case. The powerful ones think the paper disappears because they stop looking at it." He also told her that Emmett Cross had contacted 2 additional county surveyors, independent, outside the Harrow circuit, and arranged for them to survey the disputed properties formally. If the surveys confirmed the original boundary registrations, that was documentary evidence that the forged deeds were impossible. They described parcels that didn't correspond to the physical land. "When does Cross arrive?" she said. 10 days, Ansel said. "He'll come with everything compiled. Between now and then, I need to speak with every person in this town who has been directly affected or directly threatened by Crow. Anyone who was pressured, anyone who witnessed something, anyone who was present when he overstepped." He looked at her. "I know that's a difficult ask. People here are afraid of him." "Some of them," she said. "Can you help me get to the ones who aren't?" She thought about Walt Diggins, who'd voted against the suspension. She thought about Agnes Pell, who'd come to tell her about the rumors not because she was brave, but because she had a conscience she couldn't entirely override. She thought about the ranch families who'd shown up at the fire and stood there. "I can try," she said. Oh, she started with Walt. It was easier than she expected, which told her something about the pressure that had been building under the surface of the town's compliance. Walt sat down with Ansel the next morning and talked for 2 hours. He described the Merchants Association meeting in detail. Who said what, in what order, the exact phrasing Silas had used, the fact that the vote had been taken so quickly there was barely time to object. He described 2 other incidents from the past 3 years when Silas had used the association to pressure businesses that wouldn't cooperate with his land arrangements. He described it all with the precision of a man who had been waiting to say it to someone who would write it down. After Walt came the Hendersons, a ranching couple who'd had a water rights dispute with Silas the previous year that had been settled quietly, too quietly, in Silas's favor. They came together, sat close to each other, and the husband did most of the talking, but the wife corrected him when he got details wrong, which was frequently. Ansel kept writing. Agnes Pell came on her own, without her husband knowing. She sat down with Ansel and said she wanted to be clear that she didn't know if what she was saying would hold up legally, and she wasn't sure she was comfortable signing anything, but she could tell him what she'd seen and heard over 4 years of living across the street from the saloon where Silas Crow conducted most of his actual business. She could tell him about the men who went in and came out with expressions that changed. She could tell him about conversations she'd overheard through open windows in warm weather. She could tell him about the night, 2 years ago, when she'd seen two men she recognized as Silas's workers, leaving the direction of the Garrity farm at 3 in the morning before the fire that had convinced Ted Garrity to sell. There had been a fire at the Garrity farm, too. She hadn't told anyone because she hadn't been sure what she'd seen, and she hadn't wanted to believe it meant what it seemed to mean. But she'd kept it, the same way Ted Garrity's son had kept the letters in a tin box. The same way people keep things they know matter without knowing yet how. Ansel set down his pen and looked at Agnes. "Mrs. Pell," he said, "I know you said you're not sure about signing anything. I want you to think about this. What you just told me, if it's true, means that the Garritys were driven off their land by arson. The same thing was just attempted on Mrs. Mercer's property. If you have knowledge of a pattern—" "I know what it means," Agnes said quietly. "I've known for 2 years what it means. I just didn't know there was anything to be done about it." She signed the deposition that afternoon. Rowan came back on the 6th day. He rode in at dusk on scout, and he wasn't alone. There were 4 men behind him, not his ranch hands, she could tell from the way they were dressed. 2 of them had the weathered, specific look of men who worked with instruments outdoors, who spent their days measuring and recording. One was carrying a long leather case she recognized as the type surveyors used for their equipment. The 4th man was older, heavy-set, with the careful eyes of someone who had been trusted with important things for a long time. He turned out to be the head of the Regional Cattle Growers Association from 3 counties over, a man named Harlan Birch, who had known Rowan for 15 years, and who, when Rowan explained the situation to her that evening, turned out to have been waiting for a reason to put Silas Crow's business practices in front of a formal body for quite some time. The surveyors were for the land. Birch was for everything else. "Silas has been undercutting livestock prices at the county market for 3 years, Rowan said. "Selectively, only when a seller won't cooperate with him on land. He uses his volume to drive the price down on specific sellers' lots, then buys cheap when they're desperate. Birch has been documenting it but needed a formal complaint from affected parties to trigger an association review." She looked at Birch. He inclined his head. "Your case," he said, "and the Garrity case, if it holds together, gives us the standing to open that review formally, which removes Silas's ability to influence the regional market while he's under legal scrutiny." He had a slow, deliberate way of speaking that made everything sound like it had already been decided. "I'm not in the habit of moving on rumor, but what Mr. Hale has described to me is not rumor." Ansel was at the table with his notebook, and Rowan introduced them, and they went directly into the specifics without ceremony, which was the right way to do it. There was no time for anything else. Outside it was fully dark. Clara was in the back room where the wall still stood, doing her arithmetic, pressing too hard with the pencil the way she always did. Evelyn stood at the edge of the room and listened to 4 men and a lawyer begin to assemble the architecture of a case that was, she was realizing, substantially larger than her 12 acres. At some point, Rowan caught her eye from across the room. She'd thought about him while he was gone, more than she wanted to, more than made practical sense. She'd thought about what he'd said the last night before he left, about finding himself in Red Hollow with a lame horse, and about what it meant that he'd come back this time with surveyors and a cattle association official instead of just himself. She'd thought about the way he'd gone into a burning building for the strongbox without being asked because he'd understood what was in it and why it mattered. She'd thought about Clara saying his name like it had been there for a long time. She didn't smile at him across the room. They weren't there yet. But she held his gaze for a moment, long enough for him to understand that she'd seen what he'd done and she wasn't going to let it go unacknowledged. And something in his face settled slightly, the way things settle when they've been uncertain and then aren't anymore. Then she turned and went to put coffee on, because there were 4 men and a lawyer at her back table, and it was going to be a long night, and this was the thing that still had to get done. The lantern on the counter was burning low. She turned it up. The building smelled like ash and old wood, and the particular cold that comes through damaged walls, and it wasn't fixed, and the inventory was gone, and Emmett Cross wasn't here yet, and Silas Crow was still in his house at the north end of town with his forged documents and his corrupt magistrate and his certainty that a woman with $43 and a broom couldn't outlast him. But the deed was in the strongbox. The certified copy was beside it. Agnes Pell had signed a deposition. Ted Garrity was talking to Cross's office. A man named Harlan Birch had come 60 miles because Rowan Hale had asked him to, and Evelyn Mercer was still standing in her building. That was not nothing. That had never been nothing, even when it felt like it. She carried the coffee to the table, set it down without interrupting, and went back to the counter and picked up her ledger, and she began writing down the things she still needed, and the things she still had, and the distance between them, because that was the only honest way to know where you stood. Not by how it felt, but by what the numbers said, and what you were willing to do about them. Outside, Red Hollow was quiet. Silas Crow's lights were on at the north end of the street, the same as always. But the shape of what was coming had changed, and somewhere in the counting and the coffee and the low burn of the lantern, Evelyn felt it. Not triumph, nothing as clean as that, but the first solid edge of something she hadn't been able to reach for a long time. The feeling that the ground under her feet was actually hers. Emmett Cross arrived on a Wednesday morning, 4 days ahead of the schedule Ansel had given her. He came on the early coach, which meant he'd ridden through the night from the last relay station rather than waiting for morning, which told her something about either the urgency he felt or his particular relationship with discomfort. He was older than she'd constructed in her mind from the letter, mid-60s, compact, with white hair cropped close, and the kind of face that had been weathered not by outdoor work, but by 30 years of sitting across tables from people who were lying and knowing it. He carried one bag and a document case that he held with the specific grip of a man who had learned not to let it leave his hand in transit. Rowan met him at the coach stop, and they shook hands with the ease of people who had a shared history and didn't need to perform it. Evelyn watched from the front of the store, the front that was still open to the air, the frame repaired enough to keep weather out but not yet rebuilt. She'd hung canvas across the opening while the lumber was being sourced, and it moved in the morning wind with a sound like slow breathing. Cross looked at the building when he approached. He looked at it the way a doctor looks at a patient, assessing, not sympathizing. "Mrs. Mercer," he said when Rowan introduced them. His handshake was firm and brief. "I've reviewed everything Ansel sent back. Before we do anything else, I want to walk the property line with the surveyors this afternoon. I want to see what we're defending before I sit down with the documents." "The surveyors were here 2 days ago," she said. "They finished yesterday." He looked at Rowan. "They're good," Rowan said. "Took 2 days, did the full perimeter, marked the corners. Their report is at the table." Cross nodded and came inside. He spent 20 minutes reading the surveyor's report in silence. Then he read the certified county copy from Harrow. Then he laid the forged deed, the document Silas had filed with the county claiming a portion of her north parcel, beside the survey map, and he sat back, and he made a sound that was almost a laugh, but wasn't quite. "He got the measurements wrong," Cross said. Evelyn looked at him. "The forged deed describes a parcel boundary that runs 43 feet into what the 1871 registration clearly identifies as your north property line," Cross said. "The forgery is good, the paper, the ink, the county seal. Someone spent money on this. But whoever prepared it used estimated measurements rather than surveyed ones, and they're off. The surveyor's report makes it provable." He set the documents down with the particular deliberateness of a man placing a winning hand. "In a boundary dispute with 2 competing documents, surveyed physical evidence supersedes recorded description. We have the survey. He has a number that doesn't match the ground." "Will that be enough?" Evelyn said. "It's enough to void the forged deed on its own," Cross said. "But we're not going for just enough. Ansel's depositions, the Garrity connection, the pattern of conduct. We're building a case that removes Silas Crow's ability to do this again, to anyone." He looked at her directly. "That's a longer hearing, more exposure for your witnesses. I want you to understand that before we proceed." "I understand it," she said. "Some of your witnesses may face pressure between now and the hearing. He'll know what's coming." "He already knows something's coming," she said. "He's known since Cross's associate got off the coach." Cross looked at Rowan. "She's right," Rowan said. "He watches everything that moves in this town." "Then we move faster than he expects," Cross said. "I want the hearing set for 10 days from today. I'll file the motion this afternoon in Harrow, not with Dobbins, with the circuit administrator directly. I'm requesting a change of venue on grounds of judicial conflict, and I'm attaching the record of Dobbins's involvement in the previous 2 property resolutions." He paused. "That filing will get Silas's attention." "It'll do more than get his attention," Rowan said. "Yes," Cross said. "It will." "What?" The filing went to Harrow on the afternoon coach. By the following morning, it was clear that Cross had been right about what it would do. Silas Crow came to the store himself, without his men, which was unusual enough that Evelyn noticed it before he said a word. He came at 8 in the morning, before most of the town was moving, and he stood in the canvas-covered opening and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not rage, something colder and more considered, the expression of a man recalculating. "You found yourself a lawyer," he said. "I did," she said. "Cross out of Dalton," he said. "He's good. I've seen his work." He said it the way you acknowledge a strong move in a game, not warmly. "You also found someone to pay him." She didn't answer that. "Rowan Hale," Silas said. His eyes moved to her face and stayed there. "I looked into your barn guest when he first rode in. Took me a while, said he's been off the map for 3 years, which is interesting in itself. But the Hale Cattle Company isn't hard to find if you know what you're looking for." He tilted his head. "That's a significant amount of resources to bring to bear on a 12-acre property dispute." "It's not about the acreage," she said. "No," he said. "I don't suppose it is anymore." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to make you one final offer. I'll pay you twice what I offered before, twice, and I'll cover the full cost of rebuilding this store in a location of your choosing, anywhere in the county. You walk away clean, no debt, fresh start." He paused. "It's a good offer. It's better than you'll get from a hearing that I promise you will be messier and longer than your lawyer is telling you." She looked at him. "You had men lay oil along the base of my building and set it on fire while my daughter was asleep inside," she said. "There is no number after that." Something moved in his jaw. Just a small movement, the kind that happens when a man bites down on what he actually wants to say. "That's not something you can prove," he said. "Agnes Pell saw your men leaving the Garrity farm the night of their fire," she said. 2 years ago. She's a deposition." The recalculation was visible this time. She could see it happening in his face, the rapid assessment of what that meant and who else might have been watching things he'd assumed no one saw. It lasted only a second. Then the composure came back down like a curtain. "I see," he said. "The motion to change the venue from Dobbins's circuit was filed yesterday," she said. "You probably already know that. I imagine you know most things that move through this county." She picked up her broom. She'd been sweeping the back of the store when he arrived, and she picked it back up now, not aggressively, just because she was done standing still. "I think you should leave, Mr. Crow. We don't have anything else to say to each other before the hearing." He left. This time, he didn't leave slowly. The 10 days before the hearing were the strangest Evelyn had lived through since the weeks after Daniel died. A similar quality of suspension, of time moving in a way that didn't correspond to the clock. There was too much to do, and too much waiting embedded in the doing of it, and the two things existed simultaneously in a way that was exhausting in a specific, grinding fashion. Cross worked from the back table from early morning until late at night, with Ansel beside him and a growing collection of documents that spread across the surface in an order that was opaque to her but which Cross could navigate without looking. Rowan coordinated between Cross and the witnesses, not managing them, more like making sure the path between them was clear, handling the practical logistics of getting people to the table without making them feel like they were being handled. He was good at that, she noticed. He had the particular skill of making people feel like their participation was their own choice, rather than something arranged for them, which was both true and required considerable care to maintain. Ted Garrity came in from Miller's Creek on the 3rd day. He was a lean man in his 50s with sunburned forearms and the specific anger of someone who had been wronged in a way that couldn't be undone. His farm was sold, his family had scattered, and there was nothing a hearing could give him back that would make the accounts balance. But he sat with Cross for 3 hours and told him everything, in precise and sequential order, and when Cross asked him to sign the deposition, he signed it without hesitating. "I kept thinking someone would do something," Garrity said before he left. He said it to Evelyn, not to Cross. Said it like something that had been sitting in him and needed to come out to a specific person. "I kept thinking the county, or the neighbors, or someone would step in. And nobody did. Not because they didn't know, because they decided it wasn't their problem yet." "It's their problem now," she said. He nodded. He looked at the burned front of her store. "Yeah," he said, "I can see that." The Holt son, Marcus Holt, 30 years old, who'd driven 40 miles to be there, arrived on the 5th day with the tin box his father had kept, and which he had kept after his father, and which contained, among other things, a letter from a county official that no county official should ever have written, offering guidance on how to structure a voluntary sale to avoid a formal foreclosure proceeding that the letter implied was already determined. The letter was unsigned, but the stationery was from the Harrow County Administrator's office. Cross held it up to the lamplight for a long moment and said nothing. Then he put it in the document case. "That," he said to Ansel, "is the thread." On the 7th day, Silas made his move. She'd been expecting something. Cross had warned her that once the venue change was granted, Silas would understand the hearing was real and would act. The venue change was granted on the 6th day, reassigned to a circuit judge named Aldous Pemberton, out of the Eastern District, who had no prior business with Silas Crow and whose reputation Cross described as a man who read documents thoroughly and did not enjoy having his time wasted. What Silas did was go after the witnesses. Not physically. He was smarter than that, with a hearing 10 days away. He went after them economically. The Garrity's brother-in-law, who ran a small grain operation in Miller's Creek, found his line of credit at the Miller's Creek Bank abruptly called in on the 7th day. Marcus Holt discovered that the ranch in the north where he'd been working for the past 2 years had received a visit from a county inspector who cited code violations that had never been cited before. Walt Diggins found that his supplier in Harrow had received word, from an unspecified source, that his account was under review for late payment, which was false and which Walt had the records to prove, but it required time and correspondence to fight. Cross had anticipated this too. He sat everyone down on the evening of the 7th day. The witnesses, Rowan, Ansel, Harlan Birch, who had stayed rather than returned to his association, and he explained what was happening in plain terms. "This is what retaliation looks like when it's done by someone who knows he's losing," Cross said. "It's not random. He's applying pressure to the points he can reach to make your involvement cost enough that you reconsider. It's the same pattern he used at the start, just compressed, because he's running out of time." He looked around the table. "Each of these incidents is also evidence. Every act of pressure after a legal filing is a documentable act of witness intimidation. We're recording all of it. You need to know that. You also need to know that holding your ground for 3 more days is the hardest part." Walt Diggins said, 3 days. "The hearing is in 3 days," Cross said. "Once it opens, the legal record protects you in a way that it doesn't fully right now. What he does after the hearing opens becomes contempt. What he does before it is still just business." Walt looked like he understood this and found it deeply unfair, which was the correct response. "I'm in," he said. "I've been in since Agnes signed. I'm not changing that." The room was quiet for a moment. Then Garrity said the same thing, and Marcus Holt after him, and Agnes Pell, who had come that evening with her husband, who knew now and had not said a word against her for it. One by one, around the table, Rowan was the last one. He looked at Evelyn across the table, and then he said, "I need to tell all of you something before the hearing, something that should have come out earlier and that I want on the record before Silas or anyone else decides to make it a weapon." The table went quiet. I told it the same way he told it to Evelyn, without embellishment, without the kind of careful phrasing that signals a man managing your reaction. The cattle drive, the river crossing, the young man named Ellis Crane who had worked for him for 2 years and who had gone into the water and not come back out. The court's finding of no negligence, his own finding of himself, which had diverged from the court's on the question of responsibility. The 3 years of walking away from his own life. Nobody at the table said anything for a moment after he finished. Then Marcus Holt, who had driven 40 miles with a tin box because he'd kept a promise to a father who'd been broken by a powerful man's indifference, said, "How old was he?" 22, Rowan said. Marcus nodded slowly. "And you've been carrying it 3 years?" "Yes." "That's a long time to carry something that a court already ruled on." "The court ruled on the law," Rowan said. "I was ruling on something else." Marcus looked at him for a moment. "My father blamed himself for the sale," he said, "right up until he died. Said he should have fought harder, found a way. Spent the last 2 years of his life certain he'd failed us." He paused. "He didn't fail us. He was a single man with no resources and no lawyer and a corrupt magistrate and a powerful enemy. The outcome wasn't about his choices. It was about the circumstances he was in." He looked at the table. I'm not saying your situation is the same. I'm saying sometimes the weight we carry and the weight we deserve to carry aren't the same thing. The room stayed quiet. Cross looked at Rowan. Will you testify to this at the hearing? Rowan met his eyes. Yes, he said. It matters, Cross said. Not for the legal case. The legal case doesn't need it. But what's been built against you in this town is partly the mystery of who you are and what you're concealing. Silas's lawyers will use that ambiguity if they can. Taking it off the table takes it out of their hands. I know, Rowan said. That's why I'm doing it. Evelyn had been listening from her end of the table. She looked at Rowan now, had been looking at him in small increments throughout the telling, the way you look at something you don't want to stare at. And she thought about the night he'd told her, just the two of them at the back table with the stove going cold. She thought about how he'd said it the same way both times, without armor, the same amount of it both times, which meant it wasn't a performance. After the meeting ended and people filtered out into the dark, Ansel back to his room at the boarding house, Cross staying at the table with his documents, Birch to the hotel at the end of the street. Evelyn found herself and Rowan alone in the store for the first time in days. Clara was asleep. The canvas at the front moved in the night air. You didn't have to do that tonight, she said. I know, he said. You could have waited until the hearing. I could have, he agreed, but they're risking things for this case. They deserve to know who they were sitting at a table with. She looked at him. And what did you think would happen when you told them? I didn't know, he said honestly. I thought it might go badly. I thought Marcus Holt in particular might. His father died with that kind of guilt on him. I thought he might have a hard time with it. He didn't, she said. No, Rowan said. He didn't. She was at the counter, her hands flat on the wood. The lantern was between them, burning at a low, steady level. The ash smell was still in the walls. She didn't know if it would ever fully leave, or if this building would always carry it the way a person carries the smell of a thing that happened to them. I want to ask you something, she said. All right. After this is over, after the hearing, after Cross goes back to Dalton, and Birch goes back to his association, and the surveyors go back to wherever surveyors go, what do you do? He looked at her steadily. That depends on a few things, he said. On what? On whether there's a reason to stay in Red Hollow, he said. Not quickly, not with any performance of uncertainty, just directly, the way he said most things. And I'm not asking you to answer that tonight. I know the timing is wrong for that kind of conversation. I just want you to know that it's a question I'm already thinking about. She looked at him for a long moment. The ranch, she said. Your ranch. You've been gone 3 years. My foreman has run it competently for 3 years, he said. He'll run it competently for a fourth if that's what happens. He paused. The ranch isn't the question. It'll be there. The question is whether I go back to it the same way I left it, or differently. She nodded. That was enough for now. She understood what he was saying, and she wasn't ready to answer it, and he knew she wasn't ready to answer it, and neither of them made it into something that needed resolution tonight. Get some sleep, she said. Cross is going to want everyone up early. He went back to the barn. She turned the lantern down and went to check on Clara, who was asleep with one arm hanging off the side of the bed, in the way she always slept when she was completely out, boneless and trusting. Evelyn stood in the doorway for a minute. Then she went to bed. The hearing was held in the Harrow County Courthouse on a Thursday, in a room that smelled like old paper and the specific damp of a building that heated unevenly. Judge Pemberton was a tall man with a long face and reading glasses that he wore pushed up on his forehead until he needed them, which was frequently. He had the demeanor of someone who had heard a great many people say things that weren't true and had developed a specific facial expression for it. Not contempt, more like patient fatigue. Silas arrived with 2 lawyers. They were from Harrow, not local. Good ones, by the look of them, the kind that came with pressed suits and document cases that matched. They sat at the opposing table and arranged their papers with the efficiency of people who did this often and expected to win. Cross sat across from them with Ansel and one additional attorney he'd brought from Dalton, a younger woman named Frances Howe, who handled property surveying law specifically, and who had reviewed the surveyor's report and the forged deed and had an opinion about the discrepancy that she was prepared to render in technical detail. Evelyn sat in the gallery with Walt Diggins on one side and Agnes Pell on the other. Rowan sat 1 row back between Ted Garrity and Marcus Holt. Harlan Birch had a seat at the end of the row, attending in his capacity as a regional association official with a formal interest in the proceedings. The room was fuller than she'd expected. Word had gotten out through the county in the days before, and there were ranchers and merchants, and at least one correspondent from a paper in the regional capital who had a notebook open on his knee. Silas did not look at her when he entered. He looked at Rowan. It was a long look, assessing, reconfiguring. Then he looked away and sat down. The hearing opened. Cross was methodical and precise, which was, she came to understand, his defining quality as a lawyer. He didn't perform. He didn't make speeches. He walked through the evidence in sequence, building one thing on the next, and each piece he introduced was more specific and more documented than the one before. The 1871 registration, the certified copy from Harrow, the surveyor's report and Francis Howe's technical analysis of the discrepancy, the forged deed and the measurements that didn't match the ground. Silas's lawyers argued that the forgery allegation was unfounded, that the deed had been properly filed, that discrepancies in historical measurements were common and didn't imply fraud. Francis Howe explained, in the measured technical language of someone who had done this before, exactly why a 43-foot error was not a measurement discrepancy but a structural impossibility. The boundary as described in the forged deed would place the property line through the center of a water trough that county records showed had been in place since 1869. The trough predated the forgery's claimed registration date. Judge Pemberton wrote something down. Then came the pattern evidence. Cross introduced the letter from the Holt tin box, the unsigned county stationery letter, and the record of Dobbins' involvement in the two prior cases. He introduced Garrity's deposition and Agnes Pell's deposition, and he walked through the timeline of events in Red Hollow with the specificity of a man who had spent 10 days making sure every date and every action was documented. The bank pressure, the Merchants Association meeting, the fire, the post-filing retaliation against witnesses. Silas's lawyers objected repeatedly. Pemberton sustained some, overruled more. Then Rowan took the stand. He told the court who he was, not with pride, just with the factual clarity of identifying yourself when asked. The Hale Cattle Company, 1,200 head, 3 counties. He told the court why he'd been in Red Hollow, which required him to tell them about the cattle drive and Ellis Crane and the 3 years of moving. He told it the same way he'd told it twice before, without embellishment, without armor. The room was very quiet while he talked. One of Silas's lawyers attempted, in cross-examination, to use Rowan's absence from his own business as evidence of erratic character. Rowan answered each question directly and briefly. When the lawyer suggested that a man who abandoned a successful operation for 3 years over a court-cleared accident wasn't a reliable witness to anything, Rowan said, "The court cleared it legally. I wasn't disputing the law. I was disputing my own judgment. Those aren't the same thing, and I'd think a room full of lawyers would appreciate the distinction." Pemberton made no expression, but he wrote something down. Silas testified in the afternoon. He was composed and specific and presented himself as a businessman who had made legitimate offers for a property whose legal status was genuinely unclear, who had no knowledge of any fire at the Mercer property, who had never directed any associate to pressure any bank or any civic association. He said it all with the practiced confidence of a man who had told versions of this story before and found it worked. Cross-examined him for 40 minutes. He walked Silas through the timeline with the same method he'd used in presentation, one piece at a time, each one building. The bank contact. Cross had a written record of the contact, sourced from the bank's own correspondence file through a formal discovery request. Silas acknowledged communicating with the bank about the property status. Cross asked him to describe the nature of that communication. Silas was careful with his answer. Cross read from the correspondence, which was less careful. Then the Merchants Association, the meeting Walt had described in his deposition. Cross read from the deposition. Silas said Walt had characterized it incorrectly. Cross asked him to describe what had been characterized incorrectly, specifically. Silas described it. Cross noted that the description differed from Hector Price's written account of the same meeting, which Ansel had obtained from Price the previous day, after Price had, apparently, decided that the direction things were moving made his own position worth reconsidering. Silas looked at Cross for a moment. Then he looked at his lawyers. Then he looked back at Cross. "I may have miscommunicated the nature of the meeting," he said. "It was a small retreat, but the room heard it, The fire was last. Cross asked Silas about his whereabouts on the night of the fire. Silas said he was at home. Cross asked if he could identify anyone who could confirm that. Silas named 2 people. Cross noted that Agnes Pell's deposition placed 2 men she identified as Silas's regular workers leaving the direction of the Mercer property at an hour consistent with the fire's origin time, and that this was the same pattern she had observed on the night of the Garrity fire 2 years prior. Silas's composure held, but around the edges of it, something else was visible, the particular stillness of a man who is understanding, in real time, the full shape of what has been assembled against him. The hearing adjourned for Pemberton to review the full record. The ruling came the following morning. Evelyn was in the store when Cross came through the canvas-covered entrance with the ruling in his hand. His expression was the expression of a man who had expected this and was still satisfied by it. He set the document on the counter. She read it standing up. Pemberton had voided the forged deed in its entirety, finding the survey discrepancy dispositive and noting the pattern of documentation suggesting coordinated fraudulent intent. He had ordered an independent audit of the 2 prior property resolutions overseen by Dobbins, which was referred to the circuit administrator. He had referred the arson allegation to the county sheriff with a formal recommendation for criminal investigation, citing the Pell deposition and the pattern evidence. He had ordered Silas Crow to bear all legal costs of the proceeding. He had also written, in the final paragraph, and this was not standard language, Cross told her later, this was Pemberton adding something he didn't have to add, that the conduct documented in this case represented a sustained campaign to deprive a private citizen of legally established property rights through fraud, intimidation, and the apparent corruption of public officials, and that such conduct warranted the full attention of every relevant authority in the county and circuit. She read it twice. Then she set it down on the counter beside the lantern. "Is it over?" she said. "The property question is over," Cross said. "The criminal investigation is beginning. The audit of the prior cases is beginning. Those will take time. But your land is yours. That's finished." She looked at the burned front of her building, at the canvas that moved in the draft, at the ash smell she'd stopped noticing because she'd been breathing it for 3 weeks. "Thank you," she said. Cross inclined his head. "Your witnesses are the ones who made this case," he said. "Mrs. Pell especially. That pattern evidence was the architecture. Everything else was confirmation." He picked up the document case. "I'll send you the full accounting once Ansel has compiled it. Rowan's already settled the fee question, but there may be follow-on costs with the criminal matter if they ask you to testify." She looked at him. "He settled it already?" "This morning," Cross said, "before the ruling." She didn't know why that particular fact, that he'd settled the fee before knowing the outcome, not after, not once it was certain, was the one that got to her. But it did. It settled into her chest in a place that had been holding tension for so long, it had forgotten what it felt like to release. Cross left. Ansel followed with the document boxes. She stood alone in the store. After a while, she heard Clara coming down the passage from the back, and then Clara was beside her, looking at the ruling on the counter without being able to read all of it, but understanding from Evelyn's face what it meant. "Is it done?" Clara said. "It's done," Evelyn said. Clara looked at the burned front of the store. "Are we going to fix it?" "Yes," Evelyn said. "We're going to fix it." Clara considered this with the seriousness she brought to most things. Then she said, "Can Rowan help?" Evelyn looked at her daughter, at the steady, watchful eyes and the set of the jaw that was so much like Daniel's, and at the same time something that was entirely her own. "I think," Evelyn said carefully, "that's going to be up to him." Clara nodded like that was a satisfactory answer. Then she went back to the passage for something she'd forgotten, and her footsteps receded, and the canvas moved at the front of the store. And somewhere outside in the thin November light, Red Hollow was going on with its morning the way it always did, regardless of what had happened inside a courthouse 40 miles away. Evelyn put her hand flat on the ruling and held it there for a moment. Then she folded it and put it in her apron pocket, next to the place where Silas's first offer had sat 2 months ago, the one she hadn't opened. The difference between those 2 pieces of paper was everything. She went to find Rowan. She found him in the barn. Not doing anything dramatic, that was the thing about Rowan Hale that she had come to understand over 2 months of watching him move through her property and her life. He didn't mark moments. He was brushing Scout down with the same even strokes he used every morning, the horse standing quiet under his hand, and he looked up when Evelyn came through the door, but he didn't stop brushing. "Cross told me," he said. "I know," she said. "He told me you settled the fee before the ruling came down." Rowan kept brushing. "It was going to come out the same either way." "You didn't know that." "I knew it well enough," he said. She stood just inside the door, the cold at her back. The barn smelled the way it always smelled, hay and leather and horse, and the faint char that had worked its way into everything near the building since the fire. She'd stopped noticing most smells in the past 3 weeks. This one she noticed because it was the smell of the place where, on the worst night, she had sat on a horse blanket with her daughter, and a man she didn't fully understand and understood better than almost anyone. "I want to ask you something," she said. "And I want an honest answer, not a careful one." He stopped brushing. He turned to look at her. "What are you going to do now?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. Not the evasive quiet. Not the sequencing quiet. A different kind. The quiet of a man who has been waiting for a question and is making sure he answers it correctly. "I need to go back to the ranch," he said. "There are things that have been waiting 3 years that can't wait any longer. My foreman has been carrying the operation on his own, and that's not fair to him. There are contracts that need my signature, and decisions that have been deferred, and a piece of land in the eastern section that's been in a water dispute with a neighboring operation for 2 years that I walked away from and shouldn't have." He paused. "I need to go back and be what I am there. I can't keep walking away from it." She nodded. She'd known this was coming, and she'd told herself she was ready for it, and found, now that it was here, that ready was a more complicated condition than she'd anticipated. "When?" she said. "A week, maybe 10 days. I want to stay until the lumber comes in and the front wall is framed. I don't want to leave you with the building open." She looked at him. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to," he said. He said it without edge, just plainly. She looked at Scout, who was watching them both with the mild interest horses have, in human conversations they can't follow. She looked at the repaired hinge on the stall door, the one he'd fixed the first night, which she hadn't thought about because it worked now, and working things don't demand your attention. "All right," she said. He picked the brush back up. She was almost to the door when he said, "Evelyn." She stopped. "The question I asked before the hearing," he said, "about whether there was a reason to stay. I meant it. I'm not taking it back because the hearing's over and there's no more emergency to manage." He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at Scout's flank, his hand still on the brush. "I'm going back to the ranch. That's true. But going back doesn't mean the question disappears." She stood at the door. "I know," she said. "I'm not ready to answer it yet." "I know you're not," he said. "I'm not asking you to." She went back inside. Whoa. The lumber came in 4 days later, hauled on 2 wagons from the mill in Harrow, and the week that followed was the loudest Red Hollow had been in months, hammering from first light until the cold shut it down each evening, the smell of fresh-cut pine cutting through the ash smell, sawdust collecting along the base of the front wall in pale drifts that Clara kicked through on her way home from school each afternoon. Rowan worked alongside the 2 men Evelyn had hired from the ranches north of town, and he worked the way he did everything, without announcing it, without managing the other men, just doing whatever needed to be done at any given moment. The hired men figured out quickly that he knew what he was doing and adjusted accordingly. By the second day, they were consulting him on the load-bearing question at the corner where the overhang had burned through, and he was answering them in the specific language of someone who had built things before. Walt Diggins came by on the 3rd day with a box of hardware, hinges, latch plates, a set of drawer pulls for the new counter that Evelyn was having built to replace the one the heat had warped. He set the box down without being asked for payment and said he'd put it on account, and she could settle when the store was running again. She looked at him. "Walt." "Don't," he said. "Just don't. Let me do this." She let him. Agnes Pell brought food 3 times that week. Not in the charitable way food sometimes arrives. Not the covered dish deposited at the door with the downcast look of someone performing obligation. Agnes brought it in the practical way of someone who has calculated that a woman overseeing a building, reconstruction, while running a partial store from the back room and raising a child on her own, is probably not sleeping enough and almost certainly not eating enough, and who has decided to address the specific solvable problem in front of her. On the 4th day, Hector Price came. He came alone, without Cora, in the mid-morning when the street was reasonably busy. He stood outside the new front frame, the skeleton of it, the pine still pale and raw, and he looked at it for a moment, and then he came inside and found Evelyn at the back counter going through the supply list for restocking. He stood there. She looked at him and waited. "I voted to suspend your membership," he said. "I know," she said. "Silas told me it was the association's interest." He was looking at the new wall, not at her. Cora said the same thing, and I wanted to believe it was that simple, that it was a business decision and not... He stopped. "I've known you 11 years. I knew Daniel. I sat at your table the winter he was sick, and you fed 6 people because some of them couldn't afford their own wood, let alone food." He looked at her finally. "That's not the kind of person whose membership you suspend, and I did it anyway." She was quiet. "I'm sorry," he said. It came out stripped down, without decoration. Just the 2 words, which were the right 2 words. She looked at Hector Price, at the embarrassment and the genuine regret in him, and at the fact that he'd come without Cora, which meant it was his own doing and not managed by anyone. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had made a bad choice under pressure and was now standing in front of the person that choice had hurt, and that was harder than making the choice had been. "I know," she said, which was not forgiveness exactly, and not its absence. It was the honest thing, which was that she understood how it had happened even though it had hurt, and that she wasn't going to pretend otherwise in either direction. He nodded. He bought a bag of flour he probably didn't need and left. She went back to the supply list. Silas Crow left Red Hollow on the 6th day after the ruling. She didn't see him go. She heard about it from Agnes, who'd seen the wagons. 3 of them, loaded, not rushed, not panicked, but deliberate. The kind of departure that had been planned in the days since Pemberton's ruling came down, and that was simply being executed now that it was time. He was going to the county seat in Harrow, Agnes said, though no one knew what for or whether he was coming back. He didn't come back. Not to Red Hollow, not in any way she ever heard about directly. The criminal investigation that Pemberton had referred to the sheriff moved slowly the way those things move, and Cross wrote to her twice in the following months with updates. A formal charge filed, a date set, an eventual proceeding that resulted in restitution orders, and a prohibition from property transactions in the county for a period the court determined. It was not the dramatic collapse she'd sometimes imagined in the worst nights. It was institutional and procedural and took longer than felt right. But it happened. The weight of it transferred from Silas's hands into the machinery of the law, and the machinery, when it finally moved completely. The Garrity property question was more complicated. The sale had been voluntary, even if it had been coerced, and voluntary sales are legally stickier than outright fraud. Cross worked on it for months, and what eventually emerged was a settlement. Not the farm returned, because that was not legally achievable, but financial restitution from Silas's assets that allowed the Garrity family to purchase land of comparable size in a neighboring county. Ted Garrity wrote her a letter when it was done. It was not a happy letter. You can't make someone whole. Not really. Not when what they lost was where they were from. But it was a settled letter. A letter written by a man who had put something down that he'd been carrying for 2 years. She kept it in the tin box with the deed. Rowan left on a Sunday morning 8 days after the ruling. The front wall was framed and sided. The roof over the store was repaired. The new counter was in. The interior was not finished. There was still trim to go up and shelving to rebuild and the ceiling in the far corner that needed attention. But it was closed and dry, and the smell of pine had mostly overtaken the ash smell, which was the thing that had mattered most to her without her quite admitting it. He came to the back door the morning he was leaving, not the front. Clara was at the table eating breakfast. He said goodbye to Clara first, which was right, and Clara stood up and hugged him with the directness of a child who has decided to do something and does it without commentary. He hugged her back with one arm, careful and real. "You're going to your ranch," Clara said. "I am," he said. "Is it far?" "About 2 days' ride." She considered this. "Will Scout be tired?" "Scout's been rested up all week," he said. "She'll be fine." Clara sat back down and looked at her breakfast and then looked at him. "Will you come back?" He looked at Evelyn when he answered, which was the honest thing to do. "I hope so," he said. That's up to some things I don't fully control yet. Clara seemed to accept this. She went back to her breakfast with the equanimity of a child who has learned that adults sometimes give you the actual true answer rather than the comfortable one, and that the actual true answer, even when it's uncertain, is preferable. Evelyn walked him out to the barn. Scout was already saddled. He'd done that before coming to the house, which meant he'd said goodbye to the horse before the people, which she found she understood completely. He checked the saddlebags, checked the cinch. She stood near the door. "You have Cross's address," he said. "I have it." And Birch, if there's any follow-on with the association or the market prices, Birch said to contact him directly. He wrote it in the letter. "Rowan," she said. He stopped checking things and looked at her. "I'm not going to give you a list of practical instructions," she said. "You know where everything is?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he almost smiled. The real version, the one that was rare and therefore worth something. "I know," he said. She crossed the few feet between them and she put her hand on his arm, the one that had been burned, which had healed clean and left no mark worth mentioning. And she held it there for a moment. She wasn't performing anything. She wasn't making a declaration. She was just acknowledging, in the most honest way she knew, that he had come into her life as a dusty stranger with a lame horse and had stayed long enough to become something she didn't have a clean word for, and that his leaving was a real thing and not a small one, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise to make the goodbye easier for either of them. He put his hand over hers, just briefly. Then he mounted Scout. 2 days' ride, she said. 2 days, he agreed. I know where that is, she said. On a map, roughly. He looked at her from the saddle, and what passed between them in that look was not a promise exactly. They were both too careful for promises made in doorways. But it was an understanding. It was two people who had survived something difficult together and had learned in the process that the other one was the kind of person worth knowing, and that kind of knowledge doesn't evaporate just because the emergency does. He rode out. She stood in the barn door until she couldn't hear Scout's hooves anymore. Then she went inside to finish the ceiling in the far corner. The months that followed were the hardest kind of ordinary. Not tragic, not dramatic, just the daily accumulation of work and decisions and the specific loneliness that is different from the loneliness of grief because it has a direction to it. The store came back slowly, the way things that are rebuilt from the frame out come back. First functional, then familiar, then finally something that felt like itself again rather than a version of itself. The new front wall took paint differently than the old one had, and for a while she could see the line where old met new if the light hit it at a certain angle. And then the winter came and weathered them together, and the line blurred, and she stopped looking for it. She wrote to Rowan in November. A practical letter. She'd decided practical was the right register, the one that didn't require either of them to manage an emotional weight they hadn't agreed on. She told him the store was restocked and trading well, that the Merchants Association had reinstated her membership without a formal vote because nobody wanted to have that conversation on the record, that Agnes Pell had started coming in for coffee on Thursday mornings, and it had become a habit. He wrote back in December. Also practical, mostly. The ranch was as he'd left it. His foreman had, in fact, managed everything competently, which he said with a kind of specific gratitude that suggested he'd been carrying guilt about the abandonment. The water dispute in the eastern section had been resolved through a surveyed agreement with the neighboring operation, which had taken 2 weeks and no lawyers, just two men walking a property line together and deciding what was fair. He said Ellis Crane's family, the parents, who were still alive, who lived 2 counties over, had come to see him in October, which he'd both dreaded and known needed to happen. He wrote about that in 2 sentences and didn't elaborate, but the 2 sentences said enough. At the end of the letter, after the practical parts, he wrote, "The question I asked in Red Hollow is still the question I'm asking. No urgency, just so you know it hasn't changed." She read that part 3 times. Then she put the letter in the tin box and went to make dinner. He came back in March. Not announced? She hadn't known to expect him, though she'd thought about it, and Clara had asked twice in February in a way that suggested she was tracking something her mother wasn't saying out loud. He came on a Wednesday in the afternoon on Scout, who looked well-rested and rode comfortable. He tied her at the post outside the store, the new post, the pine one, which had gone up with the new front wall, and came up the steps and through the front door. The bell above the door was new too. It had a slightly higher sound than the old one. Evelyn was behind the counter serving Margaret Howell, who was buying seed packets for her kitchen garden. She looked up when the bell rang and she looked at him and she said to Margaret, in a voice that she was reasonably certain was steady, "I'll be just a moment." Margaret turned, looked at Rowan, looked at Evelyn, and said, "Take your time, dear," with the expression of a woman who understands exactly what is happening and has the decency to be pleased about it without being obvious. She finished with Margaret. Margaret left. The store was empty. Rowan was standing at the counter. He looked the same worn quality to his jacket, though she thought it might be a different jacket, and his hair was a little shorter, and he'd shaved recently enough that it was visible. He looked like a man who had come from somewhere and arrived. "You didn't write that you were coming," she said. "No," he said. "Was there a reason for that?" "I was afraid if I wrote it, you'd write back with a reason it wasn't a good time," he said, "and I didn't want to give you the opportunity to talk yourself out of something before I'd had a chance to make the case in person." She looked at him. "That's somewhat presumptuous." "Yes," he agreed. "It is." She put down the inventory sheet she'd been holding. "Claire's at school until 4. "I know," he said. "I timed it." She looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light was coming through the new front window. Bigger than the old one, she'd had it enlarged when they rebuilt, more light in the winter months. And it fell across the new pine counter that still smelled faintly of the oil she'd treated it with in January. "The ranch," she said. "You're going back to it." "I went back to it," he said. "I've been back to it since November. I'm not walking away from it again. I meant that. It's what I am, and I'm not running from that anymore." He paused. "But there's nothing about running a cattle operation that requires a man to be alone while he does it. That's a choice. I've been making it by default for 3 years, and I'd like to stop." She was quiet. "I know what I'm asking," he said. "It's not a small thing. The store, the town, what you built here. I'm not suggesting you abandon any of it. I'm asking if there's a version where none of that is lost and something else is also possible." He put both hands flat on the counter. "I don't know exactly what that version looks like. I'm not standing here with a plan. I'm standing here because the question got louder every month I was away, and I've learned enough about myself in the past 3 years to know that when a question gets louder instead of quieter, the answer is probably not to keep being quiet about it." She looked at his hands on her counter. She thought about Daniel, not with the heavy grief of the first year, not even with the ache of the second, but with the particular clarity that comes after enough time has passed that you can see a person whole. Daniel would have been suspicious of Rowan Hale. He would have been slow to trust and quick to notice the things that didn't add up. But he would have watched what Rowan did, and eventually what a person does is what Daniel had always trusted above what they said. He'd told her that once, early in their marriage, and she'd filed it away without knowing she was filing it. She knew what Rowan did. She'd had 2 months to watch it. She had a repaired fence hinge and a certified county document and a rebuilt front wall and the testimony of a man who'd stood in front of a courtroom and told the truth about the worst thing he'd ever done, as evidence. "There's a store here," she said. "That isn't moving." "I know," he said. "And Clara is settled here. Her school, her friends. That matters more to me than anything." "I know that too." She looked at him. "The ranch is 2 days' ride." "It is," he said. "But it doesn't have to be that or this. There are decisions that haven't been made yet about what any of it looks like. I'd like to make them with you instead of before you." She came around the counter. She stood in front of him, closer than they'd stood before, in the new light from the new window, in the store that smelled like pine and linseed oil, and the faint ghost of ash that was almost gone now. She looked at him the way she'd looked at the deed that first night, carefully, without flinching, trying to see the full shape of what was there. He didn't look away. "All right," she said. It was the same thing she'd said to him about the letter to Cross, about the trip to Harrow, about staying when she'd offered the barn. She kept saying it to him, and she kept meaning it differently each time, and this time she meant it in the largest way she'd meant anything in a long time. He let out a breath. Not dramatic, just a quiet breath, the kind that comes when something you've been holding settles. "I was fairly certain you'd say no," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why you didn't write first." They told Clara that evening, after school, at the kitchen table where her arithmetic pencil had made grooves in the wood from pressing too hard. Clara listened to both of them. Evelyn did most of the talking, but Rowan was at the table too, and Clara looked at him while Evelyn talked, and when they were done she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Does this mean we'd go to the ranch sometimes?" "Sometimes," Evelyn said, "and Rowan would come here sometimes, and we'd figure out the rest as we go." Clara thought about this. Could Scout be at the ranch when we're not there? "Scout lives at the ranch," Rowan said. "She always has." "And Franklin would stay here." "Franklin would stay here," Clara nodded. This was apparently the logistical framework she'd needed. "Okay," she said, and went back to her arithmetic. Evelyn and Rowan looked at each other across the table. He was trying not to smile. She wasn't trying hard enough not to. The following months were not simple. The truth of it was that two lives built separately don't merge without friction, and theirs were more separate than most. A cattle operation across 2 days of frontier and a general store in a small town that still had its complicated history and its complicated residents, and a child who was adaptable, but also 7 years old and then 8 years old, and had opinions about where her things were and where she slept and whether the dogs at the ranch were friendly enough to be near. The first time Evelyn and Clara rode to the ranch, in May, the eastern section dispute had left fences in a configuration that confused Franklin and required 2 days of adjusting him to the new grazing patterns. Evelyn spent those 2 days helping with it, and discovered muscles she hadn't used since before Daniel died. The foreman, a quiet man named Gil, who had managed 1,200 cattle for 3 years, while his employer walked the frontier anonymously, and seemed to have come to terms with this in a way that suggested considerable personal flexibility, showed her the operation with the thoroughness of a man who has been in charge of something valuable and is deciding whether to trust the person who's going to share the authority. She asked good questions. He answered them honestly. By the end of the second day, they had the beginning of a working relationship. Clara decided the dogs were acceptable on day 3, which was the threshold Evelyn had been waiting for. Rowan came to Red Hollow in July, for 2 weeks, and worked on the ceiling trim that had been waiting since March, and fixed the water drainage at the back of the property that had been causing pooling every time it rained. He sat at Walt Diggins' hardware counter one afternoon and they talked for an hour about nothing in particular, and she watched them from across the street through the store window and thought about the morning Silas had ordered him out of town in front of people who hadn't known who he was and wouldn't have behaved any differently if they had. That was the thing she kept coming back to, in the quieter moments. Not the legal victory, not the ruling, not Silas's departure, or the criminal proceedings, or the restitution. Those things mattered. They were real and they were right, and she was glad of all of them. But the thing that stayed was simpler than any of that. A tired man had ridden into town with a lame horse, and she'd offered him a meal she wasn't going to finish, and he'd turned out to be something entirely other than what he appeared, and the kindness had come first. Before the knowledge, before the usefulness, before there was any reason at all to be kind except that it was cold and there was food going to waste and a person who needed it. She'd done it without thinking. That was what she kept coming back to. She'd done it the way you do things when they don't yet feel like decisions, just like the natural next thing. And the natural next thing had turned out to be the one that changed everything. There was something in that she hadn't entirely worked out yet. Maybe she never would. But she thought it had something to do with the fact that goodness, real goodness, the kind that counts, isn't usually heroic. It doesn't announce itself. It's a meal when you have one to spare. It's not moving when someone expects you to move. It's keeping a letter in a tin box for years because something tells you it matters even when you don't know yet how. It's signing your name to a deposition when you're frightened because the alternative is living with what you didn't do. It's a woman who raised a child alone in a burned building because she'd decided that a piece of land with her name on it was worth more than the safety of leaving. The lantern was on the porch now. It had started there accidentally. She'd carried it out one evening in September when Rowan was visiting, and they'd sat outside in the last of the warm weather, and she'd left it burning when they went in, and in the morning she'd found it still there, still burning low on the last of the oil, and she'd refilled it and left it. It stayed. She didn't make a decision about it. It was just where the lantern was now, out on the porch of Mercer's general store, burning in the evening when the cold came down off the ridge, and the street went quiet and travelers came through Red Hollow, not knowing what they'd find there. What they found was a lit porch, and sometimes that's the whole of what a person needs. Not rescue, not charity, not someone to solve the problem they're carrying. Just evidence that somewhere ahead of them, in the dark and the cold, someone left a light on. Not for anyone in particular, just in case. Clara was the one who started refilling it without being asked. Evelyn noticed it one morning in October, the lantern full when she hadn't filled it, and she looked at her daughter, who was eating breakfast and pressing too hard with her pencil, and didn't say anything about it because some things are better understood than named. Daniel would have agreed with that. She was fairly sure Rowan did too.